Well, good morning. My name is Sam Williams, Managing Partner at IP Group and Head of the Life Sciences Division in London. And what I want to do today is explain our approach to life science investments, to put recent portfolio performance into the context of that approach, and then to point to some key companies and milestones to look out for over the next couple of years. I'm joined today by Jackie Fok, who is an investment manager in the Life Sciences Division, and who's going to talk about one of our key areas of interest in women's health. In terms of running order, we'll probably speak for about 25 minutes in total, followed by Q&A. So if you have any questions, please submit them during the course of the talk via the Q&A function. So by way of background, at the close of 2020, the life science portfolio was valued at £393 million. And about 3/4 of that is represented by therapeutics investments. That is companies developing drugs, cell or gene therapies, and the remainder healthcare companies, those focused on medical technologies, devices, and diagnostics. This slide highlights some of our bigger focused companies. Note that the portfolio does not include Oxford Nanopore, which is managed separately, but it does include some of IP Group's largest holdings, including Istesso, the group's second largest asset at £85 million, and Hinge Health at £42 million. The therapeutics companies are targeting a range of different diseases, from everything from cancer and inflammation to diseases of the eye. Amongst those, we'll touch on Istesso, Pulmicide, and Athenix today, with Hinge, Genomics PLC, and IESO on the healthcare side. So those who follow IP Group closely will know that there's been quite a striking turnaround in the recent performance of the division. So while we saw a 17% decline in the value of the portfolio in each of 2018 and 19, we saw 27% growth in 2020, adding £85 million in value. And there are a number of reasons for this turnaround. Again, for those who follow IP Group closely, you'll know we acquired our largest competitor, Touchstone Innovations, in 2017. And in 2018, we integrated the IP Group and Touchstone Life Science portfolios. And as you can imagine, when you combine any two businesses, there are usually structural and budgetary issues to overcome. And what you see reflected in this numbers is the early pain of a great deal of restructuring, rebudgeting, and revaluation, with the longer term benefits of the combined portfolio in terms of critical mass and scale starting to emerge in 2020. But what you're also seeing here, we believe, is the benefit of our particular investment approach starting to play out. And it's that we want to talk to you about today. So to do this, it helps to understand a little bit about our team. It consists of three investment partners, Lisa Patel, Craig Richardson, and myself, and three investment managers, Tassos Konstantinou, Jackie, and Panita Nath. And in addition, Alistair Stewart, a partner in IP Group's corporate finance division, IP Capital. We're almost all scientists by background with PhDs in molecular biology or related disciplines, and we combine that scientific background with investment, corporate finance, and business development experience. Where we're unusual amongst early stage life science investment businesses is that we also have considerable hands-on drug discovery and development expertise, which comes from having worked in big pharma and biotech. And we use that into our day-to-day operations, working closely with our therapeutics companies to help their development projects, but also in running our own in-house invention and discovery, which we'll demonstrate later. In fact, if you look at our track record between us, we've worked on 5 drugs that are now on the market and 15 drugs that have gone into clinical development. We also have a good financial track record, having either been directly responsible for or via the companies we manage, signing over $10 billion worth of licensing deals with the pharmaceutical industry and delivered over $1 billion worth of exits. And good recent examples include the sale last year of our cystic fibrosis company Enterprise Therapeutics to Roche, and the sale of cancer companies Innovata and Cure Therapeutics this year, both of which I'll come back to. Overall, we believe we're well qualified to pick the right investments and manage them to a point of significant value inflection. And that brings us on to why we do what we do. What drives all of us is the creation of products that can impact people's lives for the better, because there's nothing more satisfying for us than seeing a new product we've helped develop go into clinical studies for the first time and bring about a positive change in the state of someone's health. We call this a war on disease, and in waging this war, our primary concern is getting products to patients. Everything else is a means to an end. To do this, we consider our job comprises a few main parts. First is to identify the right science to invest in. Second, to work out the right development pathway for turning that science into a product. And third, finding the right team, the management team, to navigate the pathway. When it comes to the financing model, we'll use whichever approach we think is most appropriate to deliver the product, whether via the public markets, conventional venture capital, or through in-house financing and incubation. Lastly, as an active shareholder, our job is to help company management steer the ship. And the guiding principle here is getting the product to the patient as quickly as possible. So if that means taking hard decisions regarding company structure or leadership, then we will take those decisions. Of course, putting patients first is a strapline that many investment firms and companies use. What matters is that you believe it to the extent you stick to it, even if it comes at the expense of short-term gain. And working with an IP group, we have the freedom, if not the actual remit, to take a long-term view, which comes from not being constrained by a fixed life fund structure. But it also means you have to have an approach that allows you to create products that can impact patients differently and more effectively than it's being done elsewhere. Otherwise, you're just duplicating time and effort and wasting money. And that comes down to the science. So what is our scientific approach? Well, when we took over the new combined life science portfolio in 2018, our companies were targeting a variety of different technologies, products, and diseases. And there were merits to all of these approaches. But we realized that the unifying theme that bound the most exciting opportunities together was that of transformation. So technologies that could bring about transformation at the level of the cell, tissue, and patient. So by changing the way that cells, tissues, and sometimes patients themselves behaved, we might be able to address the underlying cause of disease and allow for cure rather than relief. On the therapeutic side of the portfolio, we might be talking about, for example, a gene therapy approach that could render a tumor cell more susceptible to immune attack, or a drug that might change the environment of the gut lining in a colitis patient, thereby enabling it to repair itself. On the healthcare side of the portfolio, we might be talking about products that could change patient behavior to prevent disease occurring in the first place. And a good example of that is Hinge Health, a US-based company in which we are an early investor, which has developed wearable devices for monitoring patient activity in the fight against musculoskeletal pain. And Hinge was recently valued at $3 billion in a Series D financing, and we remain a minority shareholder. Another example is Genomics PLC in Oxford, in which we're the largest shareholder and which has developed a genetic risk scoring tool that can be used to identify individuals at risk of cardiovascular and other diseases, thereby allowing them and their doctors to take preventative measures before they develop disease. And in IESO, we have a company whose online tool for cognitive behavioral therapy is helping patients overcome their mental health problems. So I now want to give a case study on one of our companies that exemplifies many of the facets of our investment approach, and that's Cure Therapeutics. When we took over management of the company at the beginning of 2018, it was known as Cell Medica and was really a microcosm of the many challenges and opportunities we faced across the new combined life science portfolio. The company had a range of different technologies, a significant cost base, and a rapidly diminishing bank balance, such that at several points, its future looked really pretty grim. However, the company did have one piece of science that we thought was very interesting because of its potential to treat a very rare cancer called neuroblastoma. And neuroblastoma is a particularly nasty cancer, mainly of babies and children, which usually starts in the adrenal glands, but can develop throughout the body. When the disease is aggressive, there are very few treatment options. Of cancer deaths in children, about 15% are due to neuroblastoma. Now, Cure had a new technology which offered a revolutionary approach, high risk, but potentially transformational. And in short, this involved taking immune system cells, specifically cells known as NKT cells, from the patient's body, in this case, a child suffering from neuroblastoma, and genetically engineering them in the lab to transform them so that when they were injected back into the patient, they were able to identify and kill tumor cells. So what you're effectively doing is taking a patient's immune system that cannot fight cancer and reconditioning it so that it was now able to do so. A perfect example of transformational science. The problem with neuroblastoma is that because it's so rare, it's not as commercially viable as other more common cancers. which made it very difficult for the company to raise money. But as I've said, we put patient need first. But we also knew that a second product in Cure's pipeline, which is targeted at a more mainstream cancer, lymphoma, might make the company more commercially attractive if it could achieve positive clinical data. i.e., we might be able to promote the lymphoma product as a way of providing funding for the overall company and hence the neuroblastoma product. So after taking over stewardship of the company in 2018, we put rescue financing in place and went about restructuring it, cutting costs, and appointing new leadership. And on this more stable footing, the company was able to start studies of both of its products. And what we saw in the neuroblastoma study was really quite remarkable. And these images are from one of the first children to be treated. What you see highlighted in yellow by the arrows at the top is a tumor hotspot. Ignore the bigger spot, which lights up but is not a tumor. And you can see that over the 8 weeks of therapy, the tumor is almost completely eradicated. This was unheard of at the time. This was a patient who had failed all other therapies and had a very bleak prognosis. But with the cure therapy, the disease was almost completely eliminated. And this is known as a partial response. So we now had one partial response, but as the study continued, we then saw a second patient respond in a manner which meant that their cancer was completely eliminated, a so-called complete response. We then moved the second, more mainstream lymphoma product into the clinic, and we also saw fantastic results there, with again, one partial response and one complete eradication of the patient's cancer. So this was great vindication of our decision to rescue this company. However, its funding requirements were still huge. You need hundreds of millions of dollars to compete in the cancer field. And so we decided that the best way to ensure that Cure's products continued development and found the way to more patients was with a larger partner that had sufficient resources to take on the challenge. And we found that partner in the form of NASDAQ-listed company Athenix, which acquired Cure in May for a total consideration of $185 million, with 30 million pounds of that due to us in the form of Athenix stock, providing us with a 26 million pound portfolio uplift. An important point to note here is that we did all of this with just 3 million pounds of new investment from the beginning of 2018, working very closely with management to maximize the impact of every penny, which exemplifies another feature of our approach. We watch our money very carefully and we work it very hard. So I hope that it helps exemplify our approach to managing existing investments, but we're continuously looking for new investments. And to tell you more about that, I'm going to hand over to Jackie.
Thanks, Sam. I want to start off by touching on how we think about new investments. We don't just consider new opportunities that come to us via our academic and industry networks. Rather, we like to define the areas that we want to be in and then proactively go out and find those opportunities, whether that be existing science in the area or whether we have to develop that science ourselves. So when we think about new opportunities, we usually have 4 main considerations: the disease that represents the unmet need, the biological and molecular mechanism that holds the key to that unmet need, the technological approach that may allow one to unlock that molecular mechanism, and then, of course, there is the market. We like to be flexible in our approach. So, for example, the market could be small or not yet defined, but that wouldn't put us off. In fact, I think the history of biotech has shown that some of the most profitable drugs have entered markets that were initially barely established. In that case, we might be far more driven by a new molecular mechanism, say, that an academic has discovered, and it might hold promise across a number of key pathological processes, but for which the exact disease application is still to be determined. So when weighing all of this up, the ideal opportunity, if you like, would be one that addresses a sizable potential market that has yet to be developed, such that there would be little competition and we would have first mover advantage, but the potential to address significant unmet need if we succeeded, as well as, of course, commercial gain. We would also have to believe that we had identified a molecular mechanism and technological approach that unlocks the underlying pathology of the disease in a way that no one else has been able to do. And indeed, when we look at opportunities from this perspective, there is one disease that really stands out as an obvious target to us, and that disease lies within women's health. As a group, we've always had an interest in women's health, an area of medicine widely recognized to be significantly underfunded and under-researched, compared to, say, what are considered more mainstream diseases such as cancer and cardiovascular disease. This one disease, however, really stands out as being grossly overlooked, even by the standards of women's health, and that is endometriosis. So what is endometriosis? Well, it's a condition where the tissues that normally grow on the inner lining of the womb migrate away and start to grow on other organs outside the womb, such as the ovaries, the bladder, the bowel and intestines, and even on organs as far away as the lungs. This has awful consequences, with 90% of women with endometriosis experiencing some degree of pain, some with pelvic pain so severe that they find it difficult to stand up. It is estimated that 1 in 10 women of reproductive age have endometriosis, which means that an estimated 176 million people worldwide are living with the condition. So it's a huge potential market, but it's also completely underdiagnosed. And one of the reasons why it is underdiagnosed is because the disease manifests itself so differently from patient to patient, with symptoms ranging from irregular bleeding, difficulty getting pregnant, diarrhea, vomiting, to pain and fatigue. And as a result, in the UK, it takes most women visiting their GP over 10 times and an average of 8 years to finally get the appropriate diagnosis. Anecdotally, I think there are countless stories of women being sent home by their GP with some painkillers and a recommendation that they simply just rest up. Unfortunately, by the time the disease is diagnosed, it has progressed to the extent that the only possible effective treatment is surgery to remove the endometrial lesions, or worse, a complete hysterectomy is required. Because of this underdiagnosis, the disease has not been widely recognized as a meaningful market for the pharma industry, and hence the global pipeline for novel endometriosis drugs is shockingly threadbare. If we compare to diabetes, which affects just as many people worldwide, this becomes very clear. Just looking at the US here on the slide, whereas there are 98 drugs in clinical development for diabetes, there are only 11 drugs in development for endometriosis. The only drugs on the market currently are hormone-based treatments, some of which induce early menopause, which can help with pain relief, but these are not curative and clearly not ideal for younger women. So how have we at IP Group set out to tackle this problem? Led by Lisa Patel, a partner in the division who's been thinking about this for several years now, Panita, myself, and other colleagues set off to identify new therapeutic targets in endometriosis. And there were certain characteristics we were looking for. As I've mentioned, the current hormonal therapies are inadequate, so we didn't want another hormone-based treatment. And coming back to that core scientific thesis that Sam outlined earlier, that of transformational medicine, we wanted to identify a molecular pathway that could modify the various pathogenic features of the disease. To this end, we identified in the literature a naturally occurring molecule that had been implicated in several different molecular mechanisms that we believe could represent a linchpin in the pathogenesis of endometriosis. This molecule sits on the surface of the cell, and when triggered, leads to the variety of pathological mechanisms that contribute to the severity of the disease, including growth of lesions, pain, and inflammation. So therefore, in theory, if we could develop a drug that could stop this trigger, we could potentially stop the growth of lesions whilst reducing the pain and inflammation that the patients suffer from. It's important to note that this was not a molecular target that anyone else in the field had associated with endometriosis before, but it was really our thinking and work that drew the link between the biology of this molecule and the disease. So with the therapeutic target in mind, we really wanted to partner with the best scientists in endometriosis to begin turning our idea into realization. And we're really delighted to say that we have, in Professor Horn and Professor Saunders from the University of Edinburgh, found two of the most highly esteemed leaders in the field, Philippa in the underlying biology and experimental models of endometriosis, and Andrew, an internationally renowned expert. Both Andrew and Philippa accepted our hypothesis for the possible utility of the molecule. And so with funding from IP Group, we're currently evaluating its utility within their labs. These are still early days in the project's life, but if it goes well, we would hope to found a spin-out company around the technology in the next 9 to 12 months. So I hope this has given you an idea of our approach to new investments, Handing back to you, Sam.
Thanks, Jackie. So Jackie's shown there how our team is using its own scientific insights and discovery expertise to create new investment opportunities, but we also apply this to existing companies in the portfolio. And a great example is Istesso, our most valuable holding, and its lead drug, MBS 2320, whose discovery and development has been led rather heroically by our investment partner, Lisa Patel, all the way from a lab-based project to phase 2 clinical studies. In terms of MBS 2320 itself, this provides a great example of our transformational approach to therapy. And this is seen in rheumatoid arthritis, where MBS 2320 is able to transform the characteristic of diseased bone such that it regrows and repairs itself. And you can see that here in this model of disease with new bone growth stained in red compared to the negligible amount of new bone that grows with the current standard of care. This means that 2320 has the potential to reverse the course of disease, repair damaged joints, and bring patients back to normality. In a phase 2 clinical study, we saw clear signs that the effects in models could translate to patients with evidence of bone repair as determined by MRI imaging like this one here. So MBS 2320 is moving towards a next study in rheumatoid arthritis, but in the meantime, the drug's ability to transform damaged tissue, which it does by changing the metabolic profile of various immune system and structural cells, has become evident in a variety of pathological situations, including repair of the gut lining in colitis and repair of fibrotic lung tissue. Additionally, and very recently, 2320 has shown an ability to support the growth of nerve system cells or neurons, which has implications for rare diseases of neurodegeneration, such as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or ALS. And we're aiming to initiate discussions with the regulators about new studies in these different conditions in the coming months. A second company from the existing portfolio I want to highlight as one from which we expect a great deal over the coming years is Pulmicide. And if ever you're going to see images that exemplify the transformational effect a drug can have on a patient's life, these are them. So these are images looking down the track here of a lung transplant patient who has what's known as a refractory pulmonary aspergillus infection. That is an untreatable fungal infection, which explains the white mass here. Now, this patient was given a very bleak prognosis, and many patients with this state of disease typically have only months to live. And what's remarkable is the impact that a novel antifungal agent developed by Pulmicide, PC945, had on this patient, clearing the white mass of fungal infection within 8 weeks. And similar results have been obtained from 9 patients as part of a special needs clinical program. And based on these data, the company expects to move straight to a phase 3 study later this year with results in 2023. In this case, and exemplifying our flexible approach to financing, we decided to support Pulmicide through the phase 3 study by way of a $92 million Series C financing round involving some of the world's largest life science investors, and in which we invested $10 million, giving us about 15% of the company. So coming back to our financial performance, we obviously had a good 2020, and one might wonder whether that continue into 2021 and beyond. Well, besides the sale of Cure earlier this year, we've had a few other notable successes in the first half, including the sale of our cancer diagnostic company, Innovata, to NeoGenomics for $390 million, and the NASDAQ IPO of Centessa Pharmaceuticals, in which we have a minority holding. If we look at the impact of the Innovata, Cure, and Centessa deals, and this is published information, they account for an aggregate £71 million in value accretion, which is getting close to what we saw for the whole of 2020. In terms of the overall portfolio, we see a busy few years ahead, and this milestone chart gives some idea of that, with at least 8 clinical readouts coming, at least 2 product approvals, and multiple financial milestones, including downstream payments from acquisitions. So overall, I hope that's given you an insight into how we go about our business and an appreciation of why we're feeling very optimistic about the prospects for life sciences here at IP Group. Thank you very much for listening, and now we will move to Q&A. And so I think there are a few questions have come through. There's a first one here about the pandemic. Do you think the pandemic would accelerate drug development in the same way that we've seen vaccines come to market very fast? So that's actually a very good question. I think the initial fear when the pandemic struck was that it would have a put a brake on clinical development because of the way that hospitals were being obviously overwhelmed by COVID patients. And we definitely saw a delay to some of our companies, particularly in the cancer space, actually. And so one company in particular whose clinical study depended on taking biopsies from tumors and being able to sample those tumors to detect the presence of their drug in the tumor and the effect of the drug on the tumor. And the biopsy suites in the particular clinical trial centers just simply shut down because that was seen as a little bit of a luxury in an emergency situation. So I think we definitely saw a few months of delay to various clinical studies, and I think other investment firms have reported the same. But actually that stabilized during the course of the pandemic. In terms of sort of longer term impact, I think it's going to have a very positive impact. The speed with which the vaccines have been developed has sort of opened people's eyes, the concept that that same speed could be applied to conventional drug discovery and development. And of course, it has been seen in the development of the drugs, various approved drugs that have been reprofiled for the treatment of COVID. And there were some incredibly smart studies set up in which a number of different drugs were tested, and the efficacy results came very quickly. So I think it's shown the whole industry that things can be done more quickly. It's shown governments, shown regulators, and that's definitely going to change things and speed things up. Second question on endometriosis. You note this is a very early stage. How long might it take to get to a point where you can start a trial? When can you update on this exciting area? Well, I'll let Jackie, you take that one.
Yeah, that's a good question. As you mentioned, it's very early stage. So I think this stage of the process of validating the target and gaining confidence that it is indeed a molecule we want to take forward, it will take at least 9 to 12 months for us to get to that decision-making point. But assuming that's successful, I can imagine starting a trial within 2-3 years from that point onwards. Yeah, so maybe in a year's time, we might hear some exciting news in due course.
Question, could MBS 2320 have efficacy in long COVID? That's a very good question, picking up on the point I made about its effect in models of lung fibrosis. Lung fibrosis is a symptom or a hallmark of long COVID, or some patients with long COVID. And that's quite a serious complication. I mean, fibrosis of the lung is not a good thing at all. We have had initial, very preliminary discussions with the government bodies set up to look at all potential drugs in COVID. I mean, the thing, if you look at most of the drugs that have been tested for COVID, most of them are drugs that are already approved, where the safety profile has been very well documented. MBS 2320 has been as far as phase 2 clinical studies, which is great, and it's shown a clean profile so far. But putting it into very severe patients who are in an emergency situation is obviously, has other safety concerns that one has to bottom out and think about. So that's one consideration. In terms of long COVID, all I can say, it is something we are thinking about, and we are having discussions. But I don't think you're going to hear anything in the immediate future about that. What else? Has the pandemic taken away funding from other disease areas? That is another good question. Again, I think at the beginning, the fear was that it would. At the beginning of the pandemic, first half of last year, the fear was that it might take away funding. In fact, I think, as everyone is aware, it's just increased interest in the life science sector in general. It's increase the opportunities for companies, both public companies and private companies, to raise finance, and that is now spreading beyond companies that merely have that are just focused on COVID or are so-called COVID stocks or COVID stories. There is a lot of money now at play in this sector, and I think the whole COVID episode has helped with that. So I think, if anything, it's improved the ability of companies to raise money to fund their development. There's a question here: given the amount of expertise in your team, can or should a generalist investor be active in life sciences? I think the answer is yes, that they can be and should be. And I think for the health of our sector, it's important that generalists are active in the area. I think in the earlier stage investments, the sort of things that where a lot of work goes into, and the sort of thing that Jackie was talking about, it helps to partner with a trusted investor or trusted partner. We'd like to think that we could represent that trusted partner in looking at new opportunities. So it is an area that generalists can play in, but I think it helps to come in alongside supposed specialists. What else do we have? Where does diagnostics, e.g. imaging, sit within your strategy and portfolio? Well, we do have diagnostics companies. We've talked about those. And imaging, it's very important. Imaging is an important part of quite a few clinical studies that we run for our agents. We've shown you some of the imaging we've done, for example, with MBS 2320, which was critical to our phase 2 study in rheumatoid arthritis. And obviously we showed you that data with cure and neuroblastoma too, where imaging in cancer studies is very important. In terms of new imaging, but those are typically, we're using standard imaging technologies that already exist. Although with MBS 2320, because of its unique effect on bone, we are looking at actually developing different protocols associated with MRI imaging to try and tease out some of the special effects that the drug has there. And that's the sort of thing many of our companies are active in. If their drug has a specific unique angle that has a different effect on histopathology than might otherwise have been seen in the past. And we also are investing actually in an early stage company now has developed a novel imaging technology associated with X-rays. So we hope to be able to say, we can't say much about that at the moment. It's quite early proof of concept stage, but it's looking very exciting. And of course, diagnostics is critical. Diagnostics, I don't think of it as a separate industry. It's part and parcel of therapeutics now. So, you know, a lot of products now are being developed with companion diagnostics, which can help, for example, identify patients with particular biomarkers who are more likely to respond to drug, or to identify patients who might be more likely to have a reaction, a negative reaction to drug. So that is becoming a far more mainstream part of drug discovery. What else? Cost. What is the cost to develop an average in a drug such as the endometriosis drug? I think Jackie, interrupt me if you don't agree, but I mean, in general, there are lots of people who quote numbers for developing drugs getting to market. The average is, I mean, you see numbers of billions sort of touted around, but that includes all the failures. If you have one that works, if you take one that works, it really depends on the indication. Rheumatoid arthritis is a big indication. You need quite big phase 3 studies. So you're talking the whole development process for a conventional rheumatoid arthritis drug. We actually think 2320 may have a slightly different development route, but that's for another session. You're talking sort of 150 to 200 million pounds total development costs. In cardiovascular disease, where you can have studies with thousands of patients, you're talking several hundred million. And then there are some rare disease areas where drugs can get to market for sort of 20, 30, 40 million pounds because the studies are so small. Diurnal is a great example, where, you know, we took the company public. This is our biggest public position, Diurnal, in the endocrine space, with focused on rare diseases in the endocrine space. And there we incubated the company for a long time through phase 2 studies. And, you know, it's taken tens of millions of pounds to get through phase 3s in Europe. The drug for the adult form of the disease has just recently been approved. So you know, there the answer was probably 50 million pounds in total, maybe a bit less. So it really varies. Endometriosis right through to market, you're probably talking maybe 100 million pounds, that sort of number, but to be determined. But I hope that helps answer that. Jackie, you got anything to add to that?
No, that's good.
I think that's it at the moment. So, Jackie, unless you see anything else. Oh, here's a good question. Sorry, I didn't scroll down. There seems to be a renewed excitement of AI application for drug discovery. What's IP Group's outlook and strategy for this space? So you're absolutely right. There is a lot of noise about AI being applied to drug discovery. I think that one has to be careful in separating the hype from the substance. The fact is that AI is being used by a lot of companies now in drug discovery. So I wouldn't say it's a routine tool, but it is being used more commonly than one might imagine. And the tools of AI are becoming so widespread now that it's not a surprise that you see it being applied more often than not. There are a few companies who are making a big story of it, and I think it's going to have a very important role. It's already having a role in identifying novel drugs, or helping in the identification of novel drugs. Also in the identification in the literature, in terms of scanning the literature. A lot of these companies are focused on scanning literature and pulling together references that allow them to identify novel applications of existing bits of biology, a little bit like we've done for endometriosis that Jackie explained, but we did that ourselves. So we used our own intelligence just to pull together what we had found in the literature. But there are now companies developing algorithms that will do that and try and pull those bits of literature together to identify automatically sort of new linkages between different bits of biology to try and identify new drug targets. And the really exciting stuff that's come out is this ability to model proteins, which made a big splash. I think it was last year or earlier this year, and that was, I can't remember the company, but was it DeepMind or?
DeepMind.
Yeah, and that is really quite a breakthrough. So that's very exciting. So I just think, again, we don't have an explicit strategy. We use it as an inherent part of what we do. A lot of our companies are getting active. It is something we are increasingly looking at and thinking about in terms of forming explicit strategy, but we're not there yet. Any CRISPR-related investments to be expected? Jackie, I'm not, again, lots of our companies are using CRISPR, again, as a tool. So there was a very big splashy deal done yesterday from a Harvard professor's lab, or a new spin out from a Harvard professor's lab, supposedly CRISPR Mark III, which is very interesting. We have not got any explicit investments in the area. Again, it's implicit to a number of our companies. Are we pleased with the progress at Diurnal? I mean, I think Diurnal is, we're very pleased with progress at Diurnal. Everything has worked out. We obviously had a setback 3 years ago when the phase 3 didn't hit its primary endpoint with its lead drug, Chronocort, for the treatment of congenital adrenal hyperplasia. That's the rare endocrine disorder. That was a big disappointment. We made the argument at the time that despite the trial not hitting the primary endpoint, the secondary endpoints would be sufficient for regulatory approval. The stock was obviously dead money for a year or more. And actually, we were proved right. And actually, that was fantastic testament to the company's excellence in managing that situation and getting that drug back on track and getting it approved in Europe, which came through recently. I think it's one of the most under-recognized stocks listed in the life science sector in the UK. It has 2 drugs approved now. It has sales growing from the first product, Alkindi, from the infant form of the same disease. The second product is now going to come online later this year, and its company is valued at about £100 million. So that's disappointing. We think it's too low, and that's why we believe there's considerable upside there. The news this week was very significant, and I think it's quite a technical piece of news that the FDA has agreed with the company that the phase 3 study in the US for the drug that has just been approved in Europe will be the study will be conducted under what's known as a special protocol assessment, an SPA. And what that means is that the FDA has essentially said, we agree the design of this study, and we are not going to reject the drug, your application for the drug when it comes to it, if the phase 3 works, we're not going to reject it on the basis you did the wrong study. And that happens a lot with drugs. Often companies don't follow the regulator's advice. And often the background, often the environment, the landscape changes, so the design of the study is no longer relevant to the treatment landscape. What's happening is they're taking a lot of that risk out of the equation. So we think that's very exciting. One for you, Jackie. If the endometriosis target that you're investigating is successful, what impact do you think this will have towards general funding and investment in women's health? Do you think this will encourage more investment in the field?
Yeah, I think for those who are already following the sector, I think with Femtech, I think in 2018, there was $800 million already invested in the area, but mainly that's been focused on kind of the tech side of monitoring reproductive health in women using apps and devices, etc. But in terms of the therapeutic side, we do see a small groundswell now, even in pharma companies interested in coming into the space, and that includes Bayer, for example. But I think with the increased awareness of women's health conditions such as endometriosis, maybe polycystic ovaries, and there's a long list. I think there's a lot of opportunities here for more investment to come in to basically develop better drugs for an area that's really been overlooked for too many years. So yes, I think success in the field will definitely encourage more investment into the field.
Super. Well, I think that is it. We don't seem to have any more questions. So if that is it, then again, thank you all very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And of course, if you do have any follow-up questions that come to mind later on this week, then please feel free to email us. I think you can get via investor relations at IP Group, or if you have our emails directly, please feel free to shoot us an email. Otherwise, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you on another presentation at some stage in the next few months.